Hey guys, Will here. So it's hard to believe that it's been nearly 18 months now since we first took a look at Moza Racing. Now, you guys would have seen, if you've been long-time viewers of the channel, that we've had a couple of review videos looking at various different products within their ecosystem, but they've been releasing products faster than we can keep up with the review videos. So what we've been doing behind the scenes is testing out pretty much every single product that Moza Racing sells for a long period of time now. And in today's video, what we're going to be doing is taking you through the entire ecosystem at each price point, letting you know which products we recommend, which products we don't, and where we think the value for money sits within the Moza Racing ecosystem. So let's get going. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff to get through today, but before we do get started, just a quick thank you to Moza Racing for sending across all of the gear that we're going to be looking at today for review purposes. Now, we will also be doing a lot of comparison today against a lot of other competitor products too. So it's important that you guys know that all the things that we're going to be looking at in today's video were all sent to us under exactly the same conditions. Now, if today's video does help you decide what direction you want to go with your sim rig, we will have some affiliate links in the description down below for all of the products that we talk about, from Moza Racing right through to all the other brands as well. So if you do want to help support our work here at Boosted Media, that is an awesome way of doing so at no additional cost to you. And we really do appreciate your support there. But with that said, let's get started. So let's begin the journey at direct drive wheelbases. So we've got three bases here on the table. You'll also see the R21, which is actually installed on the rig behind me. So we've got the R5, which is 5 Newton meters peak, the R9, which is 9 Newton meters peak, the R16, 16 Newton meters, and the R21, 21 Newton meters. Now, I'm not going to get today's video bogged down in pricing because pricing does vary depending on where you are in the world. As I said before, we do have some links in the description below to a couple of resellers as well as Moza directly, but I would definitely recommend do your own research there. Make sure you're getting the best price in your particular region. So we're not going to talk about pricing in today's video, but suffice to say that obviously the R5 is the cheapest, and then it goes through to the R21 as the most expensive. Now, when we did our full review of the R5 wheelbase, and I would recommend you check out the full reviews that we've done on all three of these bases, the R5 was being sold as a bundle only. So it came with this steering wheel, and they've also since released a Formula style mod for that wheel as well, which you can just bolt onto the front. You remove this wheel, replace it with this one. It actually does work pretty well. It's quite cool as a cheap alternative to having to drive Formula style cars with a round wheel, so that works really well. But yeah, they were selling it as a bundle with that wheel and the SRP light pedals. And I said at the time that I felt like it was a really good entry level, package that gives you everything you need to get up and racing, but I wasn't a big fan of the SRP light pedals, and I wished that they'd sold the R5 base on its own. Now, they do now sell the R5 base on its own, which makes it an even better value proposition. My recommendation at the time was that I felt that it was better value overall if you could stretch your budget a little bit to go for the R9 and then get yourself a decent set of pedals like Husqvarna Sprints or maybe VRS pedals, something like that. They are a significant jump up in the driving experience. But we'll talk about pedals a little bit later on in today's video. But now that they sell the R5 base on its own, I do think that it's a really great value proposition as an alternative to a lot of the belt-driven wheels that are out there. So say some of your Thrustmaster wheels, for example. So the experience with this base is very, very smooth, very precise as well. You get all that direct drive feeling that you're looking for in a direct drive wheel. It is a little on the weaker side though. 5 Newton meters for me isn't enough. If you're stepping up from something like a Logitech G29 or a G920, something like that, then you will find that it gives you everything you need to drive quickly and consistently. But if you're wanting that really immersive experience, if you're really wanting the car to sort of fight you through the corners, then you're not going to get that with this. Now, we could unpack this all day, but there is going to be a point for everybody, and depending on your physical strength will determine whereabouts this lies. But for me, it's around the sort of 12 to 14, maybe 15 Newton meter mark. But there will be a point for everybody where you transition from a point where you're feeling more immersed and you're getting the strength in the steering that allows you to sort of feel what's going on with the car, and it starts to transition into where you're just fighting against the car, and it actually will make you slower at some point. If you're really sort of having to fight against the car and use, I guess, explosive muscle movements rather than, finessed muscle inputs to handle the car, then that's actually going to end up making you slower. So for me, it's around sort of 12 to 14, 15 Newton meters at most. Will of course also depend on the type of driving that you're doing as well. But the R5 is definitely enough to get you up and running with a direct drive base. It's going to give you that quality feeling, just a little bit more on the weaker side. So I'd say if that's as far as your budget can stretch, then it's definitely a good entry point. I do think that you'll probably at some point inevitably, if you end up going down the sim racing rabbit hole, want to upgrade. Whereas I think if you were to go straight to the R9, maybe save up a little bit longer and get something like this, there's probably less chance that you'll end up ultimately wanting to upgrade from something like this. I think that the R9 does provide enough strength to keep the majority majority of people happy. And one of the things that I was really impressed with the comparison between the R9 and the R5 is that the overall driving experience, strength aside, was quite similar between the two. I was a little bit worried that the R5 might just feel sloppy and unresponsive compared to the R9, but it actually does stack up really well performance-wise, strength aside. Now, if we quickly turn these two bases to the side as well, you can see the R5 also does have a absolutely tiny form factor, which can be a factor, particularly if you're running a smaller monitor and you don't have the space to drop it between the base and the wheel. Maybe that's a little bit too close for you. Then it will allow you to get the monitor right up nice and close behind the wheelbase, which is definitely something that I appreciated about the R5. Similar with the R9 as well. You can see the size difference there between the two. And again, check out our full review of the R9 for all the details on this. But again, you can get the monitor up nice and close behind this. And the R9 really does give you a overall very well balanced driving experience. So if you're wondering about the comparison between these guys and the Fanatec CSL DD or GT DD Pro, unfortunately the Moza bases don't have direct console compatibility. There are a couple of ways around that with some third-party adapters, but the thing that's important to be aware of there is that those third-party adapters aren't officially supported by those consoles. So a software update on the console side could at any point break that compatibility. Whereas with an officially licensed product like you have with the GT DD Pro from Fanatec for the PlayStation and the CSL DD with the Xbox, you are guaranteed that native console compatibility. But yeah, overall, the actual driving experience between them is very similar. The experience is maybe a little tiny bit smoother on the R9 and the R5 than it is with the CSL DD, but overall, there's not a large difference in the overall driving experience. So then we step it up to the R16, which is 16 Newton meters peak, as we discussed earlier. Now, as you can see here, very, very different form factor. In our full review of the R16, we did pull it apart completely and show you the internals. Now, we did have a couple of concerns with build quality at the time we did our original review. They have since made some adjustments to their process, and none of the issues that we had in that original video with rust on the motor shaft and pinched cables internally are issues, or at least they haven't been with the R16 and the R21 that we have in our possession. Now, you might remember we actually sent all of that original equipment back to them and said, hey, send us another set when you're ready to go to production, because we just weren't happy with the quality and we didn't feel it was indicative of what customers would be receiving. So very different form factor here. It's going to be a love or hate thing. It is also available in an orange model as well. Look, I think it's a little bit over the top in terms of its visual design. I'd prefer something a little bit more understated and plain, but that's a subjective thing. You might absolutely love it. But my quick summary on the R16 is I think this is where the performance sweet spot is within the Moza ecosystem. The R9 is absolutely fine if that's as far as your budget can stretch. I don't think you're going to be disappointed with it, but the R16 is going to provide you with all the torque that you're ever going to need. So as I've said a couple of times now, I run between 12 and 14 Newton meters, 15 Newton meters at the absolute most. That's on my SimuCube 2 Ultimate, which is capable of 32 Newton meters. And I found on the R16, I was never running this at 100%. Now, a lot of people do argue that it's good to have a more powerful wheelbase, so you've got that little bit of extra headroom, that little bit of extra dynamic range, so you're not running into clipping issues. Honestly, when I've got this thing dialed in to suit my driving style, regardless of the type of driving that I'm doing, I don't run into any clipping issues anyway with this base. So I just didn't really find it to be an issue for me at all. So I guess you're probably wondering, why then would you look at something like an R21? Honestly, it's just going to come down to whether or not you need that additional strength. If you're a lot stronger than I am, maybe you want to have that extra strength. If you're driving particular styles of cars like Indy cars, for example, those in the real world do have a lot of strength coming through the steering. So if you're wanting to replicate the most lifelike experiences you can, then yeah, maybe you might want to step up to the R21. But it kind of comes back again to what I was saying before about that transition between, you know, fighting the car rather than feeling what the car's, you know, trying to communicate to you through the steering. And I feel like the R16 provides everything that the vast majority of sim racers are ever going to need. So I just don't really see a compelling reason to spend the extra money to get the R21 unless you're built like the Hulk and you just really need that extra strength. So the overall driving experience with the R16, again, very smooth, very well refined. They have made a lot of improvements to their software over time as well, which have refined things even further. One of the big issues that we had initially with all the Moza bases was a lot of oscillation in the steering. So when you're going down straights, the steering would want to shake itself a lot. That definitely has reduced itself over time, although it's still not quite as good as it is with some of the other alternatives like SimuCube or Acertech or Fanatec, for example. But once you've got your settings dialed in, it does provide a very good good overall driving experience. The one observation that I would have with the driving experience across all the Moza bases compared to some of their alternatives is that they do tend to require a little bit more filtering than some of the other brands do, particularly if you compare to the Acertec Forte and Invicta bases that we reviewed recently. One of the things that really impressed me about those was that they didn't require a lot of filtering, so you were getting a really kind of raw feeling sensation through the steering, but without some of that robotic feeling that you get with some other bases when you try to run them with not much filtering. So with the Moza bases, by comparison, if you try to run them with the filters turned all the way down, you do get quite a notchy and robotic feel coming through. So you do end up having to run a little bit more filtering just to smooth things out. Once you got it dialed in, it feels absolutely fine, but it is a bit of a trade-off there. You have to trade off some of the finesse and some of the detail in the force feedback to get rid of some of that robotic feel. And look, it's really a difficult thing to communicate. All I can really suggest is you watch our reviews of all the various different sim racing bases that we've tested over the years here at Boosted Media, and sort of determine from that what you think is going to suit you best. Alternatively to that, really all you can do is just try to get your hands on these things to test them out for yourselves. Everybody is going to be different, and it is a very subjective thing at the end of the day. But I think the point here is the R5 is a little on the weaker side. If it's the best that you can afford, you're going to have a great experience with it. You're certainly not going to regret buying one. But I think if you can stretch yourself to the R9, you will appreciate that extra strength. And I think if you are still worried that the R9 isn't going to be strong enough, then the R16 will certainly have you covered. So before we move on into Moza Racing's steering wheel offerings, let's just quickly touch on the quick release, because this is something that I think is absolutely outstanding and definitely has Fanatic's current QR1 quick release at least completely beat. Now, the QR1 from Fanatic, as you guys have seen in our reviews, does have a little bit of play in it. It does wobble around a little bit, has a little bit of flex. This quick release by comparison is absolutely brilliant. So they're using an NRG style quick release, which is exactly the same as what's used in a lot of real life race cars. And you can see it's as simple as literally just pushing the wheel onto the base. It clicks into position, locks it in place nice and securely. There's no play in any of the bases or wheels that we've tested whatsoever. So that's never been an issue for us in the year and a half that we've been playing around with these products. And then when you want to release the wheel again, it's as simple as just pulling on the collar and the entire assembly just comes away. It has that really beautiful kind of clunky sound to it. It just feels really purposeful and really race car-like when you install it on the rig. But just something that I wanted to quickly point out because I do think it's a really strong selling point for the Moza ecosystem. Okay, so let's move on now into steering wheels. Now, the first thing I want you guys to understand is just a little bit with regards to compatibility. Now, all of the wheels that we have in the Moza ecosystem, with the exception of the FSR wheel, if you use it with an accessory that we're gonna look at in just a little bit, are all only compatible with Moza wheelbases. So they don't have a USB port or anything like that that you can use to connect them to other ecosystems or directly to your PC. Now, the other thing that I wanna highlight here too is that unlike what you get with the Fanatic ecosystem by comparison here, even from the very entry-level wheels like the ES wheel that obviously straight at face value looks a lot more toy-like than what you get with something like the RSV2 wheel, for example, they do have the same high-quality quick release mechanisms that we were talking about just before. So slightly different way that they mount to the wheel itself. And you can see on this particular wheel, it is a plastic housing rather than the aluminium that we have on the more expensive wheels. But the fact that we have that nice solid NRG style quick release right through the entire ecosystem does mean that you get that same high quality, relatively flex-free mount on all the wheels. Obviously, being a plastic housing, it does have a little bit more flex inherent in the wheel itself, and you can see our review on the Moza R5 bundled with this wheel for more details on that if you wish to check that out. But yeah, definitely far and away beyond what we get with the simplified quick release for Fanatic with the comparable wheels to this kind of price point. Those have a lot more flex in the quick release than what this does. So the ES wheel is a 280mm diameter, so nice and versatile. You can use this to drive Formula style as well as GT style cars. A little on the small side for GT, but I do like the idea of having a smaller diameter wheel that gives it a little bit more versatility. Definitely easier to drive things like Formula style cars with this wheel than what you would find if you try to drive an F1 car with a 330mm wheel. You're gonna have a not so good time. Just becomes a little bit more vague and a little bit less precise on the inputs. So definitely a good idea, I think, here to go with a smaller diameter, particularly given that this is generally used with a R5 wheelbase. The smaller diameter, the more detailed the force feedback is going to feel as well. It doesn't have quite the same dampening effect. One thing I wish they had done is gone with a completely round design rather than the D shape here. It would just make it a little bit easier for drifting and rally style, although it is relatively easy to slip through your hands still. I just think it would have been better if it was round. You've got push button style shifters here as well, not the magnetic ones that you're gonna get on the more expensive wheels. But otherwise, I think for the money, it's a very well-rounded, well-designed, and versatile wheel. You do also, of course, have the option to switch it over. I wouldn't say upgrade because it's, you know, one thing or the other that you might want to be doing with the wheel. But you do also have the option for the Formula wheel mod. And that's only about 60 Australian dollars, I believe, as well. So relatively cheap. And I was actually surprised at just how solid this is as well. No flex there really at all to speak of, trying to twist that in my hands. So a nice simple mod there that gives you a cheap and easy way to switch between Formula and GT style driving without having to fork out for a whole entire second wheel, should you wish to do so. So we then step up to the CS wheel. Now we took a more detailed look at this wheel not all that long ago on the channel, so I'll link that video down in the description below for you guys again. But look, this really impressed me because for the price, once again, I felt like it delivered a lot of the quality components and quality feel that you want out of a more high-end wheel. And it's not really sacrificing anything that's overly important to the driving experience. So you still get your RPM LED strip along the top here. You've still got a plethora of inputs as well, and they've got nice quality metal touch points on the rotary encoders. The push button switches are still plastic, but they're plastic on most steering wheels, even ones that cost a lot more than this one does. But you've still got the aluminium actual rim here. You've got your leather bound wrapping, and you do have magnetic shifter paddles on the back here as well. And the same, again, high quality quick release that we see on the more expensive wheels. So again, a good option there if you're not quite ready to fork out for something like the RS V2 wheel, but it gives you a very similar driving experience to the more expensive rims, just with a little bit less functionality for the drop in price. So then we move across into the RS wheels. Now this was the original RS V1 wheel that we looked at back when we first took a look at Moza Racing's gear. And look, I wasn't a big fan of this wheel aesthetically. I just felt that it looked a little bit toy-like with all the colors going on. It is a relatively well laid out wheel. You've got two rotary encoders here with push button functionality. You've got your two analog switches here, which do operate in a digital manner in the software. And again, check out our full reviews of Moza's ecosystem for more details on that. But you still got the RPM LED strip, plenty of buttons here as well. And you do get the magnetic shifter paddles here with the addition of analog clutches on the wheel. But yeah, I just wasn't a big fan of this wheel aesthetically. I thought the horn button looked a little bit cheesy as well. And I know a lot of people agreed with me with regards to that. Now they've just recently released the V2 RS wheel, and that has addressed a lot of those things. So you can see straight away, this wheel looks a lot more classy, at least in my subjective opinion. You've got different knobs here for all the buttons as well. Those are plastic hat switches there on the rotary encoders. But look, in terms of functionality, it's pretty much exactly the same. You do have the addition of RGB LEDs behind each of these buttons, so you can actually go into the software and adjust those to your heart's content. But otherwise, the overall driving experience is very similar. Same shifters, same analog paddles on the back, and of course, once again, the same high quality quick release. So it's interesting that the RS and the CS are actually the same diameter as each other. I would like to see a 310 or 320 millimeter rim added to their ecosystem. I do find that for GT style cars, if this is going to be your only rim and you're not ready to step up to something like this, then this diameter is a little bit wide. It's more suited to sort of street cars, rally style driving, drifting, things like that. But I do like the fact that they do have a relatively round wheel here. You can see there is a little bit of variation around the hand grip area just to make it a little bit more ergonomic. That does come at the detriment of the wheel sort of bumping a little bit as it slips through your hands if you're drifting, but not to the extent where I think it's going to be an issue. But overall, I definitely think aesthetically the V2 upgrade is well worth the change, and I'm glad that they went ahead and did that. So then we move across into the Formula style wheels. So we've got the GSV1 wheel here now. There is a V2 wheel. For all intents and purposes, it operates exactly the same way, just with the difference in the quick release that we were discussing earlier. We also have perforated leather grips now on the GSV2 wheel as opposed to the Alcantara that we had on the V1. So just bear that in mind as well. Otherwise, operates exactly the same. This is a 300 millimeter diameter wheel. So a little bit on the wide side for some people maybe. I do tend to prefer 280 or 290 millimeter for more Formula style cars, although this is really great for GT3, GT4 and whatnot. So just a little bit more sensitive, the smaller diameter, as we mentioned before. So you will find with say F3, F1 cars, for example, they feel a little bit more vague than you get with the smaller diameter wheel. So it may not be an issue for you, but just something that I thought was worth pointing out there. Again, we've got RGB backlit buttons. We've got two rotary encoders here for your thumbs too, which is a welcome addition. Anybody that's seen any of my wheel reviews knows how much I rely on those thumb encoders. We've got 5 rotary encoders here on the face too, and those are metal hats, which feel nice to the touch if you're not driving with gloves. And then again, if we flip it around, we've got the same magnetic shifters and analog clutch paddles, and they can be assigned to other functions on all the wheels that we've seen them present on. So you can use them as a throttle and brake or a handbrake if you wish to do so, but generally most people are going to be using these as a bite point clutch, I would imagine. So then lastly, we have the FSR wheel. Now you guys would have seen this featured in a lot of our F3 racing videos recently. I've actually really grown to enjoy this wheel. One thing that I'm still not a massive fan on with this wheel is the fact that you do have to rely on the Moza Pit House software for the display to work. So this doesn't integrate with SimHub or Z1 Dashboard or any of those third-party dash apps, which is a disappointment. But having said that, the flip side to that is the ease of use. And I will admit that Moza have increased the number of different dashboards that are available in their Pit House software quite significantly in the time that we've been using this wheel. So it's good that they are continuing to support this wheel moving forward. You can see we've got the perforated leather grips on this wheel, like what we discussed with the V2 version of the GS wheel. 280mm diameter with this wheel as opposed to the 300 that you get with the GS. So that may be a selling point for this wheel over the GS for some people. As I touched on earlier, I do prefer the 280mm to the 300mm for the majority of the types of cars that I'm using this style of wheel for driving. So that suits me well. Otherwise, look, in terms of functionality, very similar to the GS wheel. Again, we've got all the same buttons and configuration here, a couple of additional push buttons here, and then again, the same magnetic shifters and analog paddles on the back. Now, while we've got the wheel spun around, you might have noticed the little RJ connection that we've got at the bottom here. So what that allows you to do is connect to a new accessory which Moza have just released, and we've been testing this out for about a month and a half now, I want to say, on the rig, and using it for my F3 videos that I've been posting recently. So this little box connects to your PC via USB here. There's a USB-B connection. There's also a USB-C connection for auxiliary power too, just to make sure you've got enough power to run all your bits and pieces. Then you've got a port here for pedals. Spinning it around this side, you've got a port for your wheelbase, your wheel, your shifter, and your handbrake. So what you can do is you can actually connect all your accessories through to this module, and that allows you to run pedals, a dash, a shifter, or a handbrake all off this without the need to actually have a Moza wheelbase. So if you are wanting to run the FSR wheel, but you don't have a Moza wheelbase, you can use this module. Just be aware that you will need to run the Pit House software to get the dash working. Also, some of the more advanced features for the rotary encoders, analog paddles, and whatnot will also require the Pit House software. Now, one little gremlin that we have noticed is that occasionally the dash will just freeze up or start responding very slowly, almost like the sample rate drops down. Also, sometimes it starts to just run with weird telemetry too in iRacing in particular. So I found if I go to a replay and I'm watching that, the telemetry will start to run the replay. And then if I jump back in the car, sometimes it does weird things and it just shows telemetry that doesn't seem to match what the car's actually doing. I haven't been able to find a solution for that as of the time of recording this video, and it is something that I've struggled with for quite a long period of time now. So if you are looking at an FSR wheel to use with another brand wheelbase, just keep that in mind. But otherwise, I have found the FSR wheel very, very comfortable to use. Ergonomically, it's really well designed, no issues at all there. No issues with flex or twist or anything like that either. You can see this one does have an aluminium enclosure here, so it is nice and sturdy. One thing that you may have noticed while we've been testing out some of the wheels here is that the magnetic shifters on Moza wheels are quite noisy. They do include inside the box a little rubber pad which you can just stick underneath that to soften it down a bit. It does give you a little bit more of a dampened feel to the shifters on the return. So if you like to have that kind of metal to metal clunk like I do, then you probably won't want to install those. It will also reduce the throw ever so slightly as well. So that's the reason why I haven't installed them. But if the metal to metal contact noise does bother you, you at least do have that option. So that is a run through of all the current wheels in the Moza ecosystem. So let's move on now to pedals. Now, this is where I personally believe the weakness is in the Moza ecosystem throughout the entire range at the moment. I feel like there are still a lot of improvements that can be made to these pedals. Fundamentally, they're okay. There's nothing, inherently wrong with them, but I just feel like there are better options at every price point throughout this range. And that's what we're gonna unpack for you guys now. So we'll start off with the SRP light pedals. Now, these are the ones that come bundled with the R5 if you buy the R5 bundle. So these are a very, very, very basic pedal set, similar to what you would get with, say, a G25 or G27 or G29. The G923 actually upgraded the pedals somewhat significantly in terms of the brake feel, and I would actually rate those pedals in terms of the actual driving experience a little bit higher than what we have here. So we've got an all metal construction here. Fundamentally underfoot, the pedals feel relatively good. They're well constructed. There's no horrible flex or anything nasty like that. So, you know, at a fundamental level like that, there's nothing wrong with them. So all three pedals using Hall effect sensors. All three pedals also have a very linear feel to them. So not really an issue when it comes to the throttle and the clutch. The clutch doesn't have any of that sort of rollover or two-stage effect like what we get if we step up into something like the CRP we'll look at in just a minute. But what I don't like about these pedals specifically is the brake. There's just no real feeling in it. Now, when it comes to brake feel in a simulator, it is a very, very subjective thing. But having said that, the fundamental things that you need to drive consistently are some sort of a threshold point that you can feel underfoot so that you can always brake to that level consistently. So if you're wanting to hit, say, 80% braking pressure inside the game, you can always hit that brake pressure and then modulate around it without varying too much in your consistency. And that's where I really struggle with these pedals. Now, if you're used to driving with a G27 or something like that, which, you know, is also a position-based system, then you'll be used to this. But what you're doing is you're relying on the position of your ankle or the position of your leg on the pedal rather than the amount of force that you're actually applying to the pedal. And because it has that linear feel to it, you don't really get a sensation of change in the force fighting against your foot. So it makes it feel rather vague underfoot compared to something more expensive. So look, I'm not trying to put anybody off. I think if this is the best pedal set that you can afford combined with the R5 Basic, if it gets you up and racing, something is obviously better than nothing. And you can definitely learn to drive quickly with these pedals. So I'm not saying don't get them if it's the best you can afford, but I'm saying if you can afford to save up a little bit longer for something a little bit better, I think that, you know, you're definitely going to benefit from that, because these are definitely the weak point in the system and the first thing that you're likely to want to upgrade. Now, of course, it is also important on a sim racing rig that you have a nice solid mount for the pedals too. And as you step up into load cell pedals, that will become more important. So if you've got pedals just mounted on the floor, for example, and you're trying to run a load cell, then you're going to find they're going to slip around, the seat might move backwards. And if you, again, anything that sort of gets in the way of being able to have a consistent input is going to create an issue. So yeah, nothing inherently wrong with them, but definitely the weakest link in the overall system. Now, they do also have a upgrade kit, or a performance kit as they call it, for these pedals. And this adds this little elastomer and spring stack here, which literally just sandwiches between the back of the pedal here. So you can see it goes in here. You can see the little linear spring in there as well, which we were just discussing. So that just bolts in here, bolts into position, and then when you push the pedal down, it operates very similar to the elastomer and spring stack that you would find in a load cell pedal, but you can see there isn't actually a load cell on the back of this. So what that does do is add a little bit more sensation under the pedal and give you that sensation of a threshold point, which you can then modulate around. So I would say that that is a worthwhile upgrade for the money. It's definitely a transformative thing for the SRP light pedals, but it still isn't gonna get you to the point of something obviously a lot more expensive. So just keep that in mind. My recommendation would be, if you can afford it, maybe save up a little bit longer and go for something a little bit more high-end when it comes to pedals. So that brings us across to the SRP pedals. Now, they look very, very similar. And again, you'll notice with both of these, they look very similar to the Fanatic CSL pedals, again, which we've reviewed here on the channel, link down below. So these, in terms of the throttle and the clutch pedal, feel pretty much exactly the same. They're both linear once again. One thing that I did notice is that these are actually using potentiometers for the throttle and the clutch, and a combination or a hybrid system with a potentiometer and a load cell for the brake, unlike the Hall effect sensors that we see on the SRP light pedal. So I'm not sure exactly why we have that difference there. I'm not sure whether maybe they have actually upgraded the SRP pedals to use Hall effect sensors since they sent these ones across to us, but it doesn't make any difference in terms of the actual feeling of the pedals underfoot. It's just a difference in how they actually operate. So one difference you'll notice straight away is on the SRP light pedals, you've just got pressed metal for the pedal plates. Over here, we've got this nice CNC machined anodized aluminium. So it does give it that more premium look and feel. Doesn't really feel significantly different underfoot, to be honest with you, particularly if you're driving with boots, you're not gonna feel the difference. But really the big difference here is the step up into a load cell. So if we spin these pedals around, you can see the elastomer and spring stack in the back here, and then you've got the little load cell sitting underneath here. So what this is doing is, rather than detecting the pedal position, remember it does also have the potentiometer here too, so it is using the position at least to some extent. But what's happening here is, as you push the pedal down, it's measuring the amount of deflection in a little metal tab on the load cell, and that is basically interpreting the amount of force that's being applied to the pedal. So what that means in a practical sense here is, when we push to the point here, we've got a nice clearly defined pressure point that we can feel underfoot, and then we can modulate our input around that in a force-based sense rather than just purely relying on the position of our ankle. So that gives you a lot more control and feel underfoot. Now, the thing that I don't like about these pedals is that you can see there's quite a lot of movement in the spring up until that point. So you've got quite a bit, and what you'll find is when you're braking, you're kind of pushing to that point almost every single instance anyway, and then sort of just modulating your input around that. So you're not really making a lot of use of this, not dead zone, but this initial phase of braking. And there's not a whole lot of adjustment available here. So they do include a couple of different springs and elastomers, but nothing really gets rid of that vague area underfoot there. So that's one thing, again, stepping up to more expensive pedals. I feel like these do a good job for the price. But again, I think provided that you have a relatively solid way of mounting the pedals so things aren't moving around on your rig or your setup, then these are probably once again going to be the first thing that you're going to be looking at upgrading. So in that sense, I would say, again, if you can afford something a little bit more expensive, then it's worth doing. And the recommendation I would have there is, these do feel quite similar to the Fanatic CSL load cell pedals. And honestly, I'm not a huge fan of those pedals either. I think, again, they do okay for the price, but when you step up to the Fanatic CSL Elite V2 pedals, and again, we reviewed those recently here on the channel too, those are absolutely fantastic value for money. They genuinely do give you, at least in my opinion, everything that you need to drive quickly and consistently for a very, very aggressive price. Now, you can, of course, step up to something like, your VRS pedals, your Husafeld Sprints, but those are a big jump up in price point. And I don't want to sort of come across as like I'm trying to encourage you to spend more money when you don't need to. So I really do feel like the sweet spot for value for money right now when it comes to sim racing pedals is those Fanatic CSL Elite V2 pedals. But yeah, my recommendation would be skip over these pedals if you can afford to spend a little bit more, because I think that they're going to end up being something that you're likely to want to upgrade anyway. So that steps us up then to the CRP pedals. Now, again, I haven't been overly impressed with these pedals, using them for a good number of months now. I've kind of gone back and forth with these quite a bit, trying other alternatives as they come out onto the market, then going back to these, testing them again. And we never really did a review on these pedals initially because I kind of wanted to see how they evolve. We included them in our initial impressions video 18 months ago now, but we never actually really unpacked it further on video at least. So I wanted to see whether they made any significant changes to these over time, and they haven't really done so. So the CRP pedals are a significant jump up in price from something like the SRP pedals that we were just looking at, but they're also a significant jump up not only from, say, the Fanatic CSL Elite V2 pedals that we were just discussing, but also the Fanatic Club Sport V3 pedals. Now, those are getting a little long in the tooth now. They have been on the market for a long time. But even if you add in the performance kit, which I do feel is an essential upgrade for the V3 pedals, they still come in quite a bit more expensive. And honestly, in my subjective opinion, I don't think that these are as good underfoot as you get with the Fanatic CSL Elite V2s or the Fanatic V3s with the performance kit. So I'll explain to you the reasons why. And again, feel free to disagree. If you have a set of these pedals and you absolutely love them, let us know down in the comments, because at the end of the day, this is just my opinion. But I'll unpack this a little bit for you now, just so you understand where I'm coming from with this. So look, I mean, the throttle feels absolutely fine. It's nice and smooth underfoot. A couple of things that I did notice here is that it does have a very loud metal to metal contact sound when it springs back into positions. So you'll hear as I let go of the pedal, it really springs back extremely loudly. And even if you do it more lightly, you kind of just get this metal clanging sound. You can even hear the sound of that spring reverberating through the assembly. So it just doesn't scream quality. Even though they look well presented, you've got the beautiful machined aluminium everywhere, and it is a full metal construction. Just underfoot, they don't have that premium feel that I would expect for something of this price point. And again, we are using rotary potentiometers here for our sensing of the position of the throttle and the clutch pedal. And it actually is quite a clever design with the cam that they've used here to actually roll over and give you that sensation. It does feel quite smooth through the transition. So I'd say that's probably the best and most authentic feeling pedal on this pedal set. But then the brake pedal on this, I just feel like they've gone overly complex with the design. So let me spin it around a little bit more here so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. So we've got a two-stage kind of effect here. Once again, you can see we've got a preload spring here in the upper arm, and then we've got an elastomer, which is a little bit more difficult to see, sitting down here. Now they do give you, like we have with the SRP pedals, the option to change these out with included different springs and elastomers. But look, I've experimented extensively with all of them. And again, I've just never really found a combination that feels exactly right to me. The best combination I found was the medium elastomer here with the harder spring in the first phase. But again, it does give you that two-stage effect. So you can threshold brake appropriately, and you can control your inputs, and you can modulate properly. So you can definitely learn to drive quickly with these pedals. But that initial phase of braking just still feels a little bit too vague for me. You just don't have the same level of control and the same level of finesse and feeling that you get with something like the CSL Elite V2 pedals, for example. And when you consider just how much cheaper those pedals are, then it's just a hard sell for me. I just don't see any reason to recommend these pedals over something like that when you consider the price difference, other than just if you're wanting to stay within that same ecosystem. The other thing that I don't like about this brake pedal is that it's really, really complex to change out the elastomer as well. This spring isn't too bad. All you need to do is just remove the clevis pin here, pull that out, and just swap the spring out. But when you want to remove and change over the elastomer, you actually need to remove the entire load cell assembly from the underside, which means you actually have to take the pedal completely off your rig. Now, if you compare that to something like the Acertech Forte pedals, for example, it's a couple of seconds to change out the elastomer in that particular example. And there's plenty of other examples. Again, you can check out all the reviews of various different load cell pedals that we've checked out on the channel to date. But yeah, these have been the most complex to change out. Now, another observation I had with this brake pedal too is that in long driving stints, so we're talking more than 20 minutes or so not particularly long, the pedal did actually seem to change in its properties as well. I think what was happening is that elastomer was actually softening up. And as that was happening, obviously the feeling of the brake pedal changes underfoot. Now that is obviously very detrimental to muscle memory. That's not something that you want. And it was definitely noticeable more so with this pedal than any other load cell pedal that I've tried in the past. So I think when you combine all of these things, I don't want to sound like I'm tearing this thing to shreds, because at the end of the day, you can drive quickly and consistently with this to a point. But when you consider the price point of these pedals, I just can't think of any reason to recommend them over some of the other options that we've looked at in the past here on the channel. So at the end of the day, we could nitpick these pedals till the cows come home, but it doesn't change the fact that these, I believe, are too expensive for what they offer. I think that there are better options at a far cheaper price point available on the market, as long as compatibility doesn't prove to be an issue further on down the line with consoles. If they do end up introducing console compatibility, that may mean that you actually have to run your pedals through the wheelbase to have that compatibility. And if that does happen, then this may well end up being the best option that you have available to you. But if you are playing on a PC, then yeah, I just think that there are better options out there. So look, I am at the advantage of having had experience with a lot of different pedals that I can draw from to make comparisons like this. But if you do own a set of these pedals and you've used other pedals as well that you can compare them to, do let us know again in the comments how your experience has been, whether you agree or disagree with my observations. But I think that'll do it for pedals for now. So let's move across now into accessories. So time to take a look at accessories. Now we're going to run through the main accessories that Moza Racing have available. There are a couple of different mounts. They've got a 200mm wheel extension as well available, which we don't have here in the studio, but we're going to have a look at their handbrake, their emergency stop, their H-pattern shifter, as well as their hub adapter. So let's start off with the hub adapter. Now we already talked about the little accessories module here, which allows you to connect your handbrake, your pedals, your shifter, and your FSR wheel at the moment. There may be other wheels which become compatible with this later on. So if you're using one of these guys with your FSR wheel, what you would do is plug in the cable like this guy into the little RJ port that we looked at before. Now, if you wanted to mount this on some other third-party wheelbase, you would need a way to mount this quick release onto your quick release hub. So what they've done is they've made available just a very basic base side quick release adapter. So it's just the hub part with a 70mm stud pattern around here. So you can see I've just bolted that to my zero play quick release, which I use on my Semi Cube 2 Ultimate. And that allows us to literally just pop it on to any quick release that we want, and then pulling on the tab allows it to release just like that. So nice and easy, relatively cheap as well. So that's going to allow you to use your FSR wheel and future wheels that are compatible with the accessory hub to any wheelbase of your choice. So moving on now to the emergency stop button. This guy's a little bit overpriced, to be honest with you guys. I just had a look now and it's around about 100 Australian dollars, I think, which is a lot of money just for a button. I mean, you can pick up a reset button like this guy from, somewhere like JCar Electronics if you're in Australia for, under 20 bucks. So all it is just a plastic, and I think there might be some aluminium in there too. Not 100% on that, but I mean, all it is just a switch that's wired through to an RJ connector on the back here. So we might have to pull that down actually and see if we can come up with a pin out for you guys so that you can build your own a lot cheaper. But I mean, it does what it needs to do. You push it in, it will cut off the torque to the wheelbase, and then you twist the knob and it releases again, gets you up and running again. So a good thing to have on your rig. I do generally recommend having an emergency stop button. There's only been a couple of instances over the last 3 or 4 years that I've been running direct drive wheelbases where I've needed it, but when you need it, you need it. It's one of those things you don't need it until you do, right? So that's the emergency stop button. Nice little convenient tabs there as well for mounting it onto whatever rig you happen to be wanting to mount it to. So let's have a look at the handbrake now. So this is able to be mounted in an upright or flat position. So it's 90 degrees tiltable. At the moment you can see in the upright position, it does kind of pivot downwards a little bit awkwardly. It works quite conveniently. If you're doing drifting or rally or something that I need to be able to just grab it quickly, I don't have to reach down. And yeah, that's the reason why I've got it in that orientation. Now, this isn't using a load cell, unlike a lot of other handbrakes that we see on the market these days, although it is cheaper than a lot of those load cell handbrakes. So there is that to consider. What this is using is a 16-bit Hall effect sensor internally to measure the position in a contactless fashion. Now, if you compare that to the Fanatic handbrake, which is very old now, that actually uses a rotary potentiometer. And I have seen a few people have issues with that taking on dirt and debris and over time becoming unreliable. In fact, I did have to clean my one out a couple of times when I was using that regularly on my rig. So yeah, I do like the design of this guy. One thing that you will notice compared to a load cell handbrake is that you don't really have that threshold point that you can then modulate your pressure around, kind of like what we talk about with load cell brakes earlier on. It's the same kind of thing with a handbrake. If you're really wanting to get into the finesse of really controlling the slip angle with a drift or something like that using the handbrake, then you may find that you miss being able to modulate around that threshold point. But if you're just wanting something that you can just grab at and pull to just initiate a slide or something like that, then this is going to do the job absolutely fine. So I'm going to reserve judgment on that, to be honest with you guys. I think it's better that you guys go watch a review from somebody that's more experienced with drifting and things where you really do need to rely on the handbrake more heavily. But for the kind of driving that I do, it suits the need just fine. And this guy can connect directly to your PC via USB, so you don't necessarily have to have the accessory hub. So that is the handbrake, and then we move on down to the H-pattern shifter, which is a relatively new addition to the ecosystem as well. Now, honestly, I've been really impressed with this for the price. It comes in quite a bit cheaper than the Fanatic shifter by comparison. One complaint that I've seen a lot of people have is that it doesn't have a sequential mode like what you have with the Fanatic one. So if you're familiar with that, and again, we do have a video on our channel where we covered it in detail, there's a little slider on the side of it, and you can move that between H-pattern and sequential mode. And it does have quite a nice action in both modes, so you can just sort of slam away to change gears. And I ran that shifter on my rig for quite some time. Now this by comparison does only have H-pattern mode. They will be bringing out a sequential shifter in the not too distant future, I understand, but obviously being a dedicated device for each function, it's not as convenient as having one device that fits all. So, you know, you might have to take this off the rig or move it out of position. Most people I don't think are gonna wanna have a H-pattern and a sequential side by side on the rig. It just gets a little bit clumsy, particularly if you're adding a handbrake into the mix as well. You wanna be able to just sort of reach across quickly and grab it without sort of fumbling to sort of make sure you got your hand on the right knob. That sounds rude. But in terms of the functionality of the H-pattern, I actually really like this shifter. I think it's got a really nice positive action to it. It does feel quite connected, like you're shifting gears in a real gearbox. Generally speaking, I'm not a huge fan of gated shifters like this one, simply because I'm not overly experienced in driving manual cars with them. I'm sure if I spent a lot more time driving cars that use a gated shifter, it would be absolutely fine. What I mean by that is the metal plate on the top here that actually stipulates exactly where the gears are located. I have tried other shifters in the past that are a little bit more clumsy than this one. Say if I'm gonna go from 5th to 3rd, I'm not finding that I'm sort of bumping and accidentally getting into first gear too often. And again, you do establish muscle memory. One little observation that I did have is that it can be pretty awkward to get into 7th gear. So what they've done here is they've got a lockout system for reverse and 7th gear. You can see the position of those on the top plate here. So you've got a standard H pattern for 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th. And then what you have to do is push the shifter down and then move it across to get it into 7th gear or reverse. Now, what I've found is if you push it down from the middle, it barely requires any effort at all to put it into that 2nd stage. So if I'm going from say 4th to 7th, which is not something I would imagine you would ever do, you can just kind of rest your hand on it and it goes very easily into 7th gear. However, if you're at the far right and far left extremities of the travel here, you have to push a lot harder to actually activate that gear. So if I'm going from 6th into 7th, it's not a simple action of just going up into 7th. I really have to kind of go push it down and then go into 7th. So it requires quite a bit of force to do that. Now, there aren't many cars in the sim racing world these days that have 7 gears on an H pattern, so I don't think that it's going to be a problem for the majority of people, but if you're driving truck sims or something like that, just something to be aware of. Likewise with reverse as well, exactly the same thing. You do have to, if you're going into reverse from the side, really push down hard to get it in there, whereas if you're going from the middle, it's very, very easy to do so. So just a couple of things to be aware of. But look, I really like the design of this overall. Again, nice and easy to mount on aluminium profile, if that's where you're going to be mounting it. And I do like the fact that they've got this faux leather gear boot in here as well. I did actually try removing this gated top plate to see if it still operated, but no, unfortunately you do need to have that gated pattern on there to make it function correctly. But I like the fact that they have that little dust seal there to stop dirt and debris from falling down inside. And yeah, overall, I think for the money, considering how much cheaper it is than the Fanatic alternative, it works really well. So then lastly, we have the Moza dashes. Now these operate in exactly the same manner as the FSR dash that we talked about on the FSR wheel earlier. So you are limited to having to use the Moza Pit House software and the dash selection that they have integrated in that software. You can't use these dashes with third-party apps like Joel Real Timing, Z1 Dashboard, SimHub and such like. So just be aware of that. As I said before, they are expanding the number of dashes they have available all the time. So there is quite a good selection there. But if you wanted to get in there and design your own layouts and whatnot, then this probably isn't going to be the dash for you. Now, the complaint that I had with this one in particular was it is quite cumbersome and tricky to mount on here. As you guys would have seen in our R16 review, there's 4 little bolts that go behind these little windows and they're quite awkward to get in place. You have to kind of line the little pins up on the assembly on the top of the wheelbase as well. Once it's installed, it's fine, but yeah, it is what it is. It was just a little bit of a pain to get installed, but it looks quite clean on the rig. Now, obviously your seating position will stipulate how clearly you can see the screen as well. So generally speaking, with their larger 330mm wheels, you can kind of see the dash in the gap between the top of the wheel and the top of the rim. But obviously if you're sitting higher or lower, that may determine whether or not you can see it. In my particular seating position here, how I like to have things configured with the wheel relatively high and my hand kind of resting like that, which is generally a good sort of seating position for GT style driving. The bottom of the screen is actually cut off by the wheel relative to my eye position, so just be mindful of that. But you can adjust your seating position around it, of course. It's just a shame that you don't have the ability to actually raise and lower the dash on the wheelbase itself. So that is the RMHD racing meter, as they call it, and that is compatible with the R16 and the R21. If you have an R5 or an R9, you're not out of luck though. So you also have the, what do they call it? The CM racing dash, and that is this little guy here. And as you can see, this guy actually plugs in via a little RJ connection, which just pigtails down and plugs into the back of the wheelbase. The same kind of idea here. Again, you do still have to run their own software, so not going to be compatible with any third-party apps. But unlike the R16 and R21 counterpart, you can actually raise and lower this within at least a small adjustment range like so. Now, in terms of the tech specs on those screens, let me just grab a box quickly here so I don't get this wrong. So we've got, it's a 5-inch display, 16.7 million colors with a resolution of 800 by 480 and a refresh rate of 60 Hertz. And look, I've found that the color reproduction is perfectly adequate. It's not the best contrast ratio in the world. Even with the brightness turned down, you do notice that the blacks are quite gray. But again, it is a dash, so I'd say, you know, it's perfectly adequate for the intended purpose. And the dot pitch is quite good as well. So if you're displaying finer text on the screen, you can read that quite easily as well. Unfortunately, they don't have any leaderboard style dashes in there at the moment, so I can't really test whether you can read really small text, but for all the dashes that they have within the software, at least at this point in time, perfectly clear and perfectly legible at the kind of viewing distance that you would expect to be viewing on a sim rig like this one. So there you have it, guys. That is a top level overview of the Moza ecosystem as it stands in the first half of 2023. And look, I'm really happy that Moza Racing exists. I think that they're a welcome addition to the sim racing hardware family. And I think you've got to commend them, whether you like their products or not, on just the sheer amount of stuff that they've managed to release, and good quality stuff for the most part too, in such a short amount of time. So yeah, I think as an overall ecosystem, they've done a really good job. There are definitely some weaknesses there. I think they still have some things they need to improve in terms of the software. We haven't talked about software a lot in today's video, but I would definitely recommend, if you are looking at buying a specific Moza product, have a look for our dedicated review videos where we've really unpacked that in a lot more detail and shown you exactly what the overall user experience is like owning and driving with one of these products. So yeah, I think there are still some improvements to be made on the software side of things. Just from an overall ease of use perspective. It is a little bit frustrating that every time you open up the software, it seems it's wanting you to do some sort of an update. I mean, it's great that they are, you know, servicing the products and keeping the products updated, new firmware updates all the time as well. But, you know, it seems like they're being a little bit reactive sometimes, that maybe they just need to take their time, get a solid build together, and then, you know, roll with that for a little while rather than just constantly updating. But it is what it is. I'm glad that they're supporting the products. Pedals are definitely a weakness in the ecosystem too. I definitely think that they need to be improved. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with them, and if they get you up and driving, then that's great. But particularly with the CRP pedals, I think there are cheaper and better options available on the market. So definitely check out some of our other pedal reviews from some of the other manufacturers to get a good idea of exactly where the value for money will sit for your particular budget. But there definitely are some standout features here as well. In particular, the quick release that they've used across their entire ecosystem, not just the more expensive wheels, is absolutely fantastic, and still, in my opinion, the best quick release that we have on the market. Although the new Acertec quick release does look very promising, we just want to wait a little bit longer to see exactly how that fares and stands the test of time before we comment on it too much. And that's definitely one to keep an eye on as well. But just overall, particularly with their wheelbases, the smoothness and the refined driving experience that you get really is very, very, very good for the price point. I mentioned earlier that you do tend to have to fiddle with filters a little bit. You need a little bit more filtering to really get the most out of these wheelbases compared to some of the other alternatives on the market. But overall, I think if you're after a reliable and smooth direct drive sim racing experience, then Moza is definitely one that is worthwhile checking out. So I really do hope that today's video has helped you. If it has, please do leave a thumbs up. And remember as well, we do have some links down in the description below for all the products that we've discussed in today's video. So if you do decide that you want to pick up anything that we've talked about, that is an awesome way of helping support our work here at Boosted Media at no additional cost to you. But above all, I really hope that today's video has helped kind of point you in the right direction for your particular price point. And again, if you do have experience with any of these products, let us know whether you agree with my observations down in the comments below. I always believe that the most value in any review video always comes from people sharing their own real life experiences and having that discussion down in the comments. So I really do appreciate your contribution in that way too. But thanks very much for watching, guys, and we will see you again very soon. Bye.